Hello and welcome to Game Titan. In today's live coding session, we are going to try to update the two-dimensional list display that we're creating and convert the storage of the state of the list from this scratched list here into a string. I did get a request last time to do the variable cleanup that I was talking about on stream instead of off, so I'm going to start out by doing that. One thing that I noticed is it's easy to tell if variables are used or not by renaming them. So if we think that one of the variables is not used, for example, DOL here, that is actually current column rows, may not actually be used. Here it's set to 0, but I'm not sure if it's used anywhere else. So one trick that you can use is to rename it and make the name really long. And I'll just copy that into my clipboard. And then if you zoom out, you can actually see which pieces of code got really long. Here, looks like that is the only one. Just to make sure, I should make it even longer. There. Now it is very obvious. That should be the only one. The other thing that should probably check is make sure that this variable is a local variable set to the sprite only, which you can see here is true because the name is prefixed with button 3. So that makes it safe to delete this. Similarly here, we can do the same thing. Zoom out. You can see that this is actually used twice. So here it's set to some initial value. Here it is actually used. Initial value must be the correct value. Otherwise, that would make any. I'll hit undo in order to get that to be its previous name. Spacing is definitely used. It's all col used, so row is probably used too. There it is. Top result. These are no longer used, I'm fairly sure, because they're remnants from a experiment that we're doing with depth first searching. We can delete those. Origin. Origin seems like it should be. It's initialized over here. I'm not seeing it in here. Oh, we hard-coded these values. -240 and 1. Those should actually be coming here, origin X. Now there you go. My most recent value is not going to be my index. That needs. But because we are stamping now instead of keeping multiple clones, that is not used anymore. My current grid value is probably also the same story. Not even in here at all. Max log I, which remember here. Grid layout dirty. Which is no longer used. It's set, but it's never read. Write only variables are always useless, because what's the point in writing value if you're never going to use it? Current rows, I think we looked at here. Actually, it's just set, but again, set but never used, so we can get rid of that. Check that it's a local variable. It is, so we can delete that. Call and clone level. Clone level shouldn't be used since we aren't cloning anymore. So this function here, clone myself, shouldn't be used. I haven't actually tried using this trick with renaming function. We could try it. There we go. We can see this function is not actually called. We can get rid of it entirely. Same thing with update target size. For now, actually that might come in useful. There, it's actually used here. Initialize grid, state grid content, stamp grid, that's definitely pick. Draw. So my code's a lot smaller now than it was just a while ago. And that helps understand it. Good to always clean up things that you're using so they don't confuse you, because things can be confusing enough already. So back to the goal of this live coding event, which is to change the use of the grid list into the use of a variable. Since all of the stamps are coming now from one single original sprite, and all of the stamping code is being run inside of that sprite, there's not really any need to have a global variable for storing the list. I think that grid on the other hand had to be global because all of the clones needed to access it. Now that there are no clones, we can actually, we didn't get rid of it. Still there. So as I was saying, since there is only one copy of the sprite now and no clones, we can actually just create a single local variable. I don't know if Scratch will let you do this, where you have a variable name, same name as list name. Try it. There's actually no problem. That will be confusing though, because this orange color is a little bit different from dark orange color, but pretty similar, so it'll be very confusing. Instead, let's call this grid string, because we'll store the grid as a string that's 1900 characters long. So the advantage of doing things as a list is that each of these items in the list here can be longer than just one character, and so if we had multiple costumes, more costumes than we have different numbers of characters, then we would be able to reference them all using these list values. With a string, you can do a similar approach where the string will have different numbers in them. So, for example, here, this grid state right now has 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, go on for 1900 more. And you could create a string that had the same characters in it. So 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, and so on. You can keep joining these together. Obviously we don't want to write 1900 drag 1900 join blocks into our code. That would take a really long time. So instead we can use some code so that hopefully we can only use one join block. But the string at the end will end up looking something like it'll look something like this. The 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, and so on, up to 1900. One thing I'm not actually sure of is if Scratch has some limit on the length of strings. That may turn out to be a problem here. Foil this attempt to speed things up, strings, or see if strings make things any. So we will need to change all the places that reference grid, and I hadn't actually thought of this before, but we could use the same trick to see where all of those pieces of code are. And in other programming languages, there's editing programs that will let you find all the places that a certain variable is used and highlight them and go through them one by one, which makes this a lot easier. But works pretty well for our purposes. So here, move this code out, we'll replace it entirely. This code is totally irrelevant because we're going to update grid content. I'm going to update the grid string instead now. And then this code here is stamping the grid. So we'll need to set the costume number based on the string instead of the list. This change might actually be the easiest to make. Let's rename this back to just grid. Grid. And we can use the same approach where the string will have zeros and ones in it. So what will happen here is that instead of saying item I of grid, there is a similar string I had to step away for a moment. Now I'm back. So we're looking for a similar string function to getting the getting the I item of this list, and that function is this one. And you can see that they even look really similar. Here, the list has, in this case, 1900 items in it, and we can get any of the 1900 items. Whichever item number is stored in I variable. And the same thing will happen for the string. We'll get the we'll get whichever letter is stored in this I variable of the variable that we just created. Grid string. So these two pieces of code look really similar because they do very similar things. In fact, in some programming languages, there is no difference between a list and a string. A string of characters is just the same thing as a list of characters, and they're treated exactly the same because there are a lot of similarities between the two. Get rid of the plus button accidentally. And this piece of code should be at this done. So moving here to update grid content. It's very likely that the structure of the code is going to be the same. So here, and before we do this, it will be important to remember what the performance of previous code. Let us actually move this code back in, and we can tell where it was. Duplicate copy of it over to the right. Visually, that will be pretty obvious. Make this bigger and run the code. And let's get rid of this grid display. Look at the number of times that extinct. Right now, it's about fluctuating quite a bit actually. So it's not. I've seen it jump up to about 60. Mostly it's hovering in the mid-20s. So if we call that FPS about 25 and as high as 60, we can refer to that. So let's take this back out and put the spring version in. Look for the other pieces of code that we need to. One of them is here. This is the one that goes through every item in the list and changes it to a new random number between 0 and 1. So instead of doing that, what we can instead do is use this join function, and what we'll do is we'll initially, in the beginning, set the string to be empty, and then every time we loop, we will add one more of these random numbers between 0 and 1 to either the beginning or the end of the string. Oftentimes, internally, it's faster to add new things to the end of the string, so I'm going to guess that that's what we want. Here, take the current value of the string, we'll join it with one extra character, which is coming from like random. And here now, instead of replacing item I, now we can replace the entire contents of grid string with itself joined with this one extra character. And in the beginning, we do need to clear it out. Otherwise, it will just keep getting longer and longer and longer. Here, the same code. Previously, we were setting I so that we could keep track of how many times we need to go through this loop, and still doing that. In the list version, we didn't actually need to clear out the list initially because we're using the replace block instead of the add block. I do not believe that there is similar in Scratch where you can change. There's no set letter one of string. So we do need to clear out the string at the beginning, and each time through, instead of replacing, this is effectively doing the same thing as adding to the end, where it takes the old version of the string and adds either 0 or 1 to the end, and sets that as the new. That's the second piece of code that we needed to update. And here's the third. This is the one that creates the list to have the correct number of items in it in the first place. To call add anymore. I need to call delete all. So here, there's a length of grid function, expression function, that I think Scratch calls a reporter. Length of grid, which there is actually a very similar length of string function that does the same. Length of grid, the list, you will do length of grid string string. And instead of delete all of grid, maybe you can pause here and think about what the equivalent Scratch code would be. It would just be to set the string to be the empty string. That makes its length 0 for the string. When you delete all of grid, that makes the list length 0. Then, in here, we're adding zeros, so this would be what we're doing before, where we set grid string take the old value, wouldn't actually do anything. That. Join the old value with the 0. That's what. So we'll set the new value of grid string to be the old value plus another 0. If if we zoom out again, those were the 3 pieces of code that looked like they needed to be changed. Nothing else changed. We should be ready to run the test again. I think we had it in this. Try it out. Didn't remember that this variable was still being displayed, but this is actually showing the same debugging feature that showing the grid list had been doing. And even though the numbers won't be the same because it's changing constantly, we can bring them both up at the same time to compare them. So here we have the first element of the first character of the string is here, the second one is here, the third one is here, the fourth one is here, and those correspond to 1, 2, 3 all the way until you get to forget what it is, but then the next one after 1 and up right here. The same thing with the list, where this was the first pixel. We can also see that the frames per second is actually slower, so the join operations may have been slower than the list replace operations, but it may be the case that updating this debug slowing it down, so make sure we turn those off so that we're comparing. So we can definitely see that this is slower. It's hovering around, I want to say 20, up to 23. Let's call that 20 with a high of 23. So this was the list results, and this now is a single character join about 20 SY at 20. The thing that's different about this code than before, these 2 pieces of code are probably very similar in their performance. Looking up one of the many characters in the string and looking up one of the many items in the list, those are both pretty simple. The thing that's different here than before is that replacing an item in a list, like I thought last time, is actually generally pretty fast. But here, what might be happening is that each time we do this, we might be creating a whole new copy of the string over and over and over again. And so this may actually be what one way to potentially test this out would be instead of having this function here, clearing this, we could just set the grid string to the entire contents of what it should be, like that. Interestingly, it's really. So, this is definitely faster than before. Previously it was around 19 or 20, 23 or 20. Still slower than what it used to be listed. This only gets called once in initial here, so this cannot be the only code that can be affected. here, this letter. So since the join operation is not happening, and literally all we're doing here is replacing the string with it, we could actually do one more. Let's see if that. And it might have a little bit, but really not very. Oh, there it went up. If we put that back in, it did make a little. And I suppose the one other thing we could do is this by setting this noise to. And really that doesn't make much there. So interestingly, the list approach was actually pretty fast. So that is probably the way to go with future experiments with speeding this up. So I will go ahead and revert all of these changes back to the way things were after this stream is over. If you found this helpful or interesting, please subscribe to the YouTube channel at youtube.com/realgametitan and like this video, leave a comment. It will really help out with YouTube's ranking algorithm and making sure that this gets seen by more people. Thanks for watching, and talk to you next time.